Yo, what is up guys, Grim here, and in today's video we're going to break down all of the changes to bow builds, and we're going to kind of get to the bottom of whether they're any stronger, or whether you should try and look into building one in the Siege of the Atlas expansion. So we're going to be going over it all, but first, if you haven't liked the video or subscribed to the channel and you really like the content, make sure to do so. It really does help me out. Without further ado, let's get into it. So the first thing we're going to need to tackle here is the two different families of bow builds. There is in fact two sides to this coin. There's more spell-based bow builds, kind of like Toxic Rain, Explosive Arrow, and Caustic Arrow, which are fantastic league starters. They're very good at bossing, they scale very well, and they don't really need a lot of gear. And then on the other side of the coin, we have stuff like Lightning Arrow, stuff like Ice Shot, Tornado Shot, and to some extent Elemental Hit, which is the complete opposite. They require insane investment, they're not very good at bossing, they're not very good at league starts. So both of these builds types are kind of getting buffs, they're getting improvements. Toxic Rain's getting brought down a little bit, but everything else is getting an improvement. But we're only going to be talking about the speedy builds, the Lightning Arrow, the Tornado Shot, and the Ice Shot, because those are the ones with the problems. Those are the ones that need to be brought up, and that's pretty much what everyone's hoping that they're going to be able to league start or play comfortably as a second build. So we're going to be tackling those. So whenever I talk about bow builds, that's what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about Toxic Rain and stuff like that. They're kind of doing really well. They don't need much love, and they're going to be just fine as they have been for the past few leagues. So let's get into it and let's tackle bow builds. But first, we need to kind of understand the situation that bow builds are in right now. What kind of content can they run? What kind of strengths do they have right now? What people playing them for? And what weaknesses needed to be addressed to kind of get them to a point where more people could play them. So to kind of give you the bird's eye view, guys, bow builds right now are in a really niche place. They absolutely dominate a few types of content, and they're basically the absolute best at it, but that's pretty much all they're good at. And to even get to that point, you need to invest an absolute ton of currency, and we're going to go over those pieces of content now, and I'll kind of explain why they're just so good at it, why they're the dominant force, and why nothing can really beat them. So the first one up here is speed mapping. So this is pretty much any in-map kind of content, Legion farming, Delirium farming, Blight farming, Nemesis 3 farming, all this kind of stuff like that. Bow builds are the king. They pretty much fully dominate this space, and nothing really does come close. Since the days of Blade Vortex or something like along those lines, and Stormbrand, since those got nerfed, it's pretty much been a bow kind of game. And bows have pretty much been the dominant force, or one of the most dominant forces in this space, since the inception of the game, pretty much. And that really hasn't changed. So it's been a niche they've dominated for the longest time, and they will continue to dominate, and you'll see why that is when we get to the strength section. The next one here is emblem farming. So emblem farming is a super duper niche activity, which generally requires a headhunter, incredible speed, and incredible AoE to get a ton of currency out of the Legion mechanic. And this is something that is pretty much entirely dominated by bow builds, namely Lightning Arrow builds. And most people that you see doing this kind of content will be having a bow equipped, and it's something that pretty much bows excel at, which is a pretty cool one. Finally, we have magic finding. So magic finding, bows get a little bit of a leg up, a bit of a cheat here. They have the only magic finding weapon in the game, meaning that it's kind of almost like a bit of a kind of default to go to bows because they have more magic find than any other kind of archetype with the Wind Ripper bow. But in addition to that, magic finding is all about speed, efficiency, and having as much, kind of magic finding as possible. And those really do align with the strength of bows as well. So those are the three main pieces of content that people think about and want a bow character for, and they pretty much excel at and are number one in pretty much every single one of those categories, with a few exceptions. There has been some things in the past that bow builds are super duper good at, like deep delving and stuff like that, but those are pretty niche and not really engaged with by most of the community. So those are the kind of main things that people think about. And bows really aren't very good at much else. They're not good at bossing, they're not really good at league starting, they're not really good at progression, they're not very good at leveling, they're pretty much not very good at anything else. And to even get to the point in which you can complete these three types of content, you need to invest, like 50 or 60 exalts to get it feeling really good. To kind of really put it out there for you guys, most of the people's league start builds, like a Detonate Dead build, Toxic Rain, any sort of these builds completely outstrip the bossing potential of even a mirror tier bow build, which is kind of ridiculous. Overall, it's a kind of a joke. So those are the main pieces of content that you can be expecting to run, and those are the only things that bows are really used for. So let's get into the strengths of bows and why that pieces of content are kind of like they're so good at it. And then we'll move on to the weaknesses, which is the main thing we're going to focus on with the buffs and nerfs that GG has put forward. So first up here, we have the strengths. So coverage. Pretty much no one beats bow skills without, the use of a pre-nerf explodey chest in terms of coverage. We're talking click once, delete the whole screen, whether that's tornado shot, lightning arrow, ice shot, or anything like that. The chain mechanic, the projectiles going everywhere, it's just unbeatable when it comes to coverage. And as a mapper, you cannot beat it, and it's pretty much, one of the more powerful kind of skill types. It's very responsive, it's omnidirectional, and it's a lot of fun to play. The next one here is speed. Obviously speed and coverage kind of go hand in hand. If you can blow up the whole screen, you're going to be able to move a lot faster, but it's also pretty handy that the Ranger gains a lot of access to very fast ascendancies in the Raider and the Deadeye, and it also gains access to a lot of movement speed kind of passives on its side of the tree. It's very easy to pick up movement speed, and it's very easy to go very, very fast with bows. So definitely pretty nice there. And the last strength here, bit of a cop-out, I know, but bows are one of the best scaling archetypes with Headhunter, and due to the fact and the nature of bow builds being so expensive already, most bow builds you see, which are, pretty successful, are going to have a Headhunter on them anyway, as it actually does solve a lot of the weaknesses the builds have, but it further pigeonholes itself into a mapping archetype, which is, already a pretty big problem for it, and kind of just rules out any kind of bossing capabilities it has without absolutely astronomical gear. Okay, so let's move on to the main part of this video, the weaknesses and how they might be addressed. It's fair to say that bows aren't good for league starters or really much of any of that, and I think the main things that we want to see here is that bows are better to level up through the story. They're better in league start scenarios, so they can actually kill a few of the bosses and, maybe get through some serious kind of style content without getting absolutely slam dunked, and we'd like to make them a bit cheaper when it comes to what they're good at. We don't want to have a mirror tier bow, a corrupted void fletcher to be able to, not have the pierce on there. This is all just completely ridiculous to be able to get an effective bow character going. So let's look at those weaknesses first, shall we? So the first weakness here is low damage. If you compare a bow skill to, like a spell, it has basically the same damage effectiveness and absolutely no flat damage inbuilt on it. This is obviously because you can use a weapon, but in order to get a good weapon, you're gonna have to spend a lot of cash to even get close to the amount of raw values on a spell, meaning they start off very, very weak, and one of the main things that we're gonna need to have is an improvement to weapons in order to allow players to actually be able to use bow skills and have any respectable damage. One of the byproducts of having low damage is bow builds need to invest basically into damage on every single slot to even come close to spell builds in terms of their single target potential. So that's why you see a lot of bow builds kind of going for a Hiri's Eye, a kind of chest piece. They've got a damage quiver on, they've generally got damage gloves, they've probably got a damage helmet on, damage belt, just damage everywhere to even get close to enough damage to even clear the content in the game. So it's a really big concern and a really big problem that bow builds have, and one of the byproducts of that is that if you're investing everything in damage and you're trying to get as much out of it, everything as you have, you're going to have basically next to no defense. With most bow builds not even having resistance capped and relying on, their flasks or Headhunter to even get the amount of resistances they need to even get into a map, which is definitely not good. You're unable to gear for stuff like minus max, elemental weakness. You can forget having curse immune. Most of the time you're not ailment immune unless you're a Raider. It's an absolute mess. And on top of that, to even get the skills functional, you need a massive amount of gear. Remember that low damage? Without a really good bow, you're pretty much not going to be going anywhere. And then on top of that, to top it all off, you're a self-caster. This essentially means on bosses, when you're dodging around, you're not dealing damage to the boss, so you can forget having a massive uptime on your DPS, and when compared to something like a totem build or a dot build, it's just not even close. You're going to have a lot harder time on these kind of encounters, and unless you have insane burst or using something like ballistas or mines, you're not going to have a very easy time bossing, and you're basically going to need insane gear or the ability to freeze the bosses or something along those lines to have any chance of doing bosses really, really well. Okay, so that's quite a few weaknesses to overcome here. It's definitely going to be tough, but let's get into the changes that GGG have planned for bows specifically. There are a few other auxiliary changes in the works, like for example, permanent marks being available. This will help bows a little bit. They're not gem stuff, so they'll definitely be able to take full advantage of this, and it's some pretty good quality of life, but most bow builds were already taking advantage of marks. However, it is definitely something to consider moving forward. So, Let's get into the primary things that GG have buffed. They have dramatically buffed bows themselves and the ability to roll a good bow. It's much easier to roll a good bow, we'll get into that in a second here. And they've also, given some slight buffs to quivers. But the main story here with quivers is that they've introduced some new base types, and that's important. But we'll get to that in a second here. So in order to be able to solve any of the issues of bows, the main thing is accessibility to damage, and damage early, specifically in the story and early on in maps. That's what we really need access to, and then maybe if we have enough damage and we're not absolutely grasping for air, we can have some time to invest into defense on some of our slots. So that's what we're kind of looking for here, and that would also solve the problem of gear reliance. You're never really going to solve the self-caster problem. The only way to do that is to kind of overcompensate on this kind of play style in terms of its damage, and that's exactly what they're doing on self-cast and hand-cast. So overall, that's kind of what we're looking to solve here. All right, let's get into the first change here. So they've increased the base physical damage on bows by up to 50%. So what this means is, if you take like a spine bow, for example, let's see if we can bring up a profile here. So let's take this spine bow, for example, here. You can see the physical damage on it is 289 to 651. That base roll, of which everything kind of scales off, is going to be increased by up to 50%. Now, I was pretty curious how close to 50% this would be, so I decided to shoot a message over to GGG, because this was the main thing I was interested about, and I wanted to know whether or not 50% actually meant 50%. So they've informed me that the main bows receiving this 50% bonus are actually bows that are going to be in the story, kind of early on in progression, which is actually a fantastic change. It means that bow leveling is going to have up to 50% more base damage on all of its bases, and most players are going to be using a physical based bow, maybe with a bit of elemental thrown in there, but it's very easy to access physical based items using the whetstone and the rustic sash recipe, so there definitely could be a world in which you could smoothly level through the story now as a bow based character using ice shot or lightning arrow, something like that, which is particularly exciting, and I'm quite happy with that change. It's going to make leveling as something like a Rain of Arrows character quite appealing, and it's definitely a really big solution there, so you're probably going to have a lot easier time throughout the story as long as you're constantly picking up bow bases and upgrading them using the whetstone rustic sash kind of recipe, or maybe throwing a few essences at bows here and there. So that's very exciting, and that's a very, very big deal. They have also mentioned though that some other bow bases on the kind of higher end of the levels will also be receiving some, kind of base physical damage buffs, which is again really, really good news for being able to acquire a much more powerful bow much earlier on. If they buff the base physical damage, for example, on a spine bow by 20% more, then suddenly a lot more players are going to be able to gain access to what is now considered a mirror tier bow for far, far cheaper, and maybe even be able to self-craft it, with essences or something along those lines. This is absolutely a fantastic change, and it's going to make bows a lot more accessible in the early game, which is exactly what we need. Okay, let's get on to the next change here. So they have actually just doubled down on making bows much, much easier to obtain, and they have made it so that the actual bow stats on the elemental side of things, like the flat elemental, are much, much higher. We're talking like up to 50 to 60% higher. To kind of give you guys an example here of how much higher, if you take the current flat added cold on bow bases, Tier 1 flat added cold on a bow, which is pretty hard to roll, is 190 to 218 cold damage. Now, after the changes, it's going to be 300 to 348 cold damage. That's over 50% more, which is completely insane. That's a really, really big deal, and it means that rolling an elemental roll on your bow is going to be a lot easier. What was previously tier 1 is now going to be a tier 2 or tier 3, and if you manage to get the tier 1, you're going to be a lot more powerful, meaning overall that bows are going to be much easier to acquire, and they're going to be much more powerful when you do acquire a really, really good one, smoothing out that power progression and making it a lot easier to kind of get into, which is really, really great. Now, they have also introduced a new system in which that the damage rolls of bows actually scale up faster. So what this means essentially is that, that new 300 to 348 roll of the T1 cold is going to be closer to T2, meaning there's not a massive kind of gulf between T2 and T1. Right now, I think it's about 100 top end damage between a T1 and a T2 roll on flat cold, for example. This is going to be a lot smaller. Essentially what this means is that all of the bad bows are going to be closer to the best bows because because of the rolls are kind of closer to T1, which is just good. Basically, it's going to make bows much more acquirable. It's going to make the bad bows a lot better. And it's going to make mediocre bows really, really good, kind of equal to what is a really insane bow right now, which is super duper awesome. It's going to make the main issue, getting a good bow, a lot easier, which is really sweet. All right, next up we have some new bow masteries. This isn't really a big deal. None of these seem to be absolutely big game changes. Some of them are kind of like more utility based. There was one in there which said that you might gain some extra damage with ballistas. This is probably the most interesting one. This is a high damage amount. You might want to throw a ballista in there. But overall, these aren't really going to have any major impact from what I can see currently, outside of maybe shoring up some accuracy here and there. The downside of this is it actually did remove one of the quality of life bow masteries, which was the phasing and 8% movement speed one, which does actually kind of detract a little bit away from one of the strengths of bows, but overall it shouldn't be a big problem. These masteries probably aren't too much to consider. Okay, so the other thing they've targeted here is quivers. Now, bows are all well and good. They're absolutely something that needed buffing, and we didn't really have access to too many good unique bows. The best we had pretty much is Arborix or Death's Opus, which are both, you know, kind of mediocre. Arborix is pretty decent, but it's not really accessible outside of, you know, getting to red maps. It's generally, you know, reasonable, like, you know, kind of 20 or 30 kind of chaos range. The other bow we had is Lionized Glare, which really doesn't help either. It's not that great, but now the ability to kind of craft your own bows is super good. Now, the problem here is when we get to quivers. So there is two absolutely stellar quivers on offer for bows. You have the Hiri's Demise quiver, which is an absolute powerhouse and used by most dex stacking characters that kind of scale cold damage through the dexterity stat, and a lot of other characters just to boot, because, you know, Deadeyes, Raiders, they have a ton of dexterity naturally, and this quiver is just going to give you a ton of flat damage. It's got attack speed, it's got attributes, it's got life gain on it. It's pretty much got everything you'd want from a quiver. It's completely insane. The only thing it doesn't have is life, ironically. But overall, it's pretty hard to compete with that quiver until you get into some serious big guns in terms of quivers, which you're crafting yourself. Now, the other side of the spectrum is Void Fletcher. Void Fletcher is kind of an item which kind of shores up one of the biggest weaknesses of bows and kind of turns them into, you know, a different kind of character build. Essentially, Void Fletcher gives bows the ability to burst damage. It gives bows the ability to burst bosses, and overall, this really helps them with, you know, clearing map bosses, which I know most builds can do pretty easily, but bows have trouble with, and it definitely does shore up one of their biggest weaknesses. And this, unfortunately, kind of leaves no real room for rare quivers. Rare quivers aren't really used unless they're being mirrored, and that's because they've got 6 perfect stats, and, you know, let's see what they can do to kind of help that. Now, the big downside of quivers is that you can either use Hiri's Demise, which is pretty damn good, or a Void Fletcher. Unfortunately, Void Fletcher is very expensive, because not only do you need to acquire it off Uber Elder, which is, you know, one of the endgame bosses, but you also then need to corrupt it and hit a corruption implicit on it to make it so that it's not piercing. Now, one thing they could do is change this kind of base type on Void Fletcher, not require it to be corrupted anymore. This would make it a lot more accessible, and as such make bows a lot more accessible to everybody, or they you know, could introduce some obviously massive quiver buffs. So let's see what they've got cooked up for here, and let's see if it can finally compete with the unique quivers that we already have on offer in terms of what they've done here. So the first change they've done is added new quiver bases. So this is probably one of the best changes they could have done. It's easily accessible power, and the power they have on offer here is actually quite strong. There's bases which have insane flat physical damage on them. There's 30% increased elemental damage with attacks, which is essentially like kind of equal to adding a 7th mod to your quiver. That's on the level of what we're kind of talking here. And then there's even one which gives you Fizz extra chaos for all those toxic rain enjoyers. So, you know, overall, those are the main 3 quivers I would be talking about here. There's also an attack speed one, which I think is about 12% attack speed. All of these are about on, you know, kind of par with a T2 or a T1 quiver roll. So it's basically a 7 mod quiver, which is pretty damn good. They're on bases as well, which means you get instant access to them. And the best ones are, you know, coming into play around the end of the story. It's not like they're Atlas bases or anything like that. So you're going to be able to pick them up as soon as you're in white maps, further adding to the accessibility of power early on and making it a lot easier to play a bow build in the story, and then also in white maps, which is exactly what we needed. It's going to make it a lot better and a lot smoother to play there. Now, does this kind of solve or help us out with the unique quiver department? Well, it really depends what type of quiver bases these new uniques end up on. So, is Void Fletcher still going to be a penetrating arrow quiver? If it gets, for example, the physical damage base, or the elemental damage with attack base, that kind of offsets the quiver bases even being introduced, because you're still going to want to use Void Fletcher, or you're still going to want to use Hero's Demise. However, if they get really bad, bow bases, and they kind of stay on bad bow bases, maybe there's a little bit of an argument now for kind of moving over to a different quiver. However, I doubt it. Those two quivers are very, very powerful. It's going to take a lot to be able to move on to a rare quiver. However, it is very good in the early game before you get these alternatives. However, Hero's Demise does come online pretty damn quick, and you're definitely going to have it by yellow maps, but this does help you out in white maps. Alright, so the next one here is that they're adding +1 arrow to quivers on the base mod pool. So basically this is going to give you a massive amount of +1 arrow quivers to choose from. This is going to be great for the early game, as I mentioned. Maybe for some builds, it's going to give you the option to kind of forego going for a Hero's Demise. But generally, +1 arrow is generally kind of inferior in terms of what it offers compared to a Void Fletcher in terms of the damage. The only real reason why you'd want +1 arrow is for single target, or if you're playing something like a tornado shot and you really need the clear. Overall, it's not too bad, but it's not going to change anything overall. Next up, we have improved quiver stats. So this is mainly attack speed and physical damage, and it's nothing insane at that. I think it's about 3 or 4% more attack speed on the attack speed rolls that you can get on quivers, and it's also about about 10%, probably about 50% more physical damage on the roll that you can get on quivers. So this is pretty damn good, but is it going to match up to Void Fletcher? Probably not. Is it probably going to match up to Hero's Demise? Probably not. So overall, the quiver base kind of is pretty nice. Those bases are going to be pretty sweet, especially for the early game, and maybe even for the late game, depending on what kind of quivers we get on terms of the Void Fletcher and stuff like that. And then the other ones are just kind of quality of life, and they're going to make your transition into endgame a lot smoother. So pretty damn good. So let's kind of go over the buffs here and do a bit of a zoom out. So does this stuff help with the issue of bows? Absolutely. It helps every single issue on this list except Self-Caster. So low damage is being somewhat addressed. They're increasing the top end of bows by quite a lot, and they're kind of lowering the gap between, insane gear and lower gear. And they're also making it much easier to acquire early on, making the earlier bow bases pretty good. So your leveling is going to be way easier. Your early on progression going to be very easy, well, way easier in white maps, and then it's going to be smoothed out to some extent in yellow and reds onto the late game due to the fact it's going to be much easier to acquire a good bow, and overall it should be a lot smoother, which is pretty damn nice. Pretty excited for that. However, there is still some obstacles to overcome. Quivers, I don't think these changes are anywhere near as impactful as the bow changes, and a lot of these numerical changes are going to have to be seen on the actual patch notes. So the difference between adding like 5% more damage to the best bow base and 30% more damage is a massive deal. Overall, that's going to really impact just how easy it is to gear up a bow character. But for the most part, it's looking pretty damn good. And as I mentioned earlier on the video, there are some auxiliary changes like the mark changes, which are going to make it much smoother to play a bow build as well early on. You're going to get much easier access to Sniper's Mark, and that's going to be something that you can be rocking the whole time as soon as you get access to those skill gems, which is a really big deal on bosses. And I imagine it's going to be pretty easy to play a bow character through the story as a result. However, in classic GGG fashion, whenever there's a bow build buff, they have to have some bow build nerfs. So here we go, we got some nerfs. So the first thing is the destruction of Hydrosphere. Pretty much Hydrosphere is a non-thing now, you're pretty much not going to be using it. However, while some bow builds did take advantage of this, it's not as impactful as some people would have you believe. This character here, by my friend Crouching Tuna, is using it. He's using it primarily to kind of chain off with Ice Shot. This is the main offender. Ice Shot builds kind of got double damage to some extent from Hydrosphere, but when you're playing Lightning Arrow, and to a lesser extent Tornado Shot, you're not getting that much value. Unless you're doing some extreme cheese with Hydrosphere, you were getting probably about maybe like 10 to 20% more damage off your Hydrosphere. Maybe a little bit more if you're using Bone Chill and Peacock. So those are the things that you're maybe going to have to solve with some other things on your gear, but overall it's not a massive loss. It's not a huge blow to the archetype, and the changes to bows in terms of the elemental damage as well as the physical damage more than offset that, as long as they aren't too skimpy on the physical damage that they offer us on the bows. So overall, pretty damn good, and I'm not too worried outside of that. In addition to that, a lot of bow builds, a lot of the really high-end deck stacking ones, didn't even use Hydrosphere. It wasn't really required. However, these buffs do rely a lot more on Headhunter, but you know, in its niche, it wasn't as impactful as a lot of people would have you believe. So yeah, let's continue on. Alright, so next up we have the Void Fletcher is getting a nerf. So we don't know how big this is going to be. Doesn't sound like a mechanical nerf, but it is getting a nerf. And this is pretty much no surprise. It is pretty much the dominant quiver, unless you're dexterity stacking or you don't have the money for it. Overall, it's pretty much a no contest, and with the new buffs to the quivers, they obviously want you to be using a rare quiver, but I still think most people are going to be using Void Fletcher, unless they make it, you know, way harder to acquire, or they actually nerf the damage by that much. It would have to be a pretty significant margin though, because it gives you pretty much everything bows need. It gives you burst damage, you know, and that's pretty much all you get. It gives you tons of flat damage, which is what you really need as bows, and overall it's a really good quiver. If they make this on a much more accessible base, i.e. not on a pierce base, this is actually probably going to be a buff for most players who couldn't get their hands on it before. Let's move on though. So the last nerf here is the support gem nerf, and this one is probably going to be pretty noticeable to people, especially in the early game. So support gems, specifically the added damage ones, so added lightning and added cold and awakened added lightning and cold, have received a small nerf. So this works out to be about, so before they were 277 to 341 for an awakened added cold, and now they're at 188 to 282 for an awakened added cold. So basically they've got, you know, quite a lot less damage. However, this is more than made up for in the massive changes to the flat damage on bows and how easy it is to get now, and it's probably going to push you in a direction where you're not even going to want to use these gems for the most part. You're probably going to want to be using other things like inspiration or something along those lines. So overall, those are the changes. Let's zoom out and give you guys the full picture. So are bow builds still limited to the content at which they're already good at and niche at? Pretty much, yeah. They're not going to be running around doing endgame bosses on week 1, and they're certainly not going to be a pushing kind of build. Unless you're trying to go for like a first level 100, you know, like an aura bot or something like that, they're not really a league start pushing build. It's not like a Toxic Rain build. You're not going to be pushing Cirrus on day 1 or day 2 with a bow build. However, they are still really, really good at what they are, you know, kind of built to do. They're still going to be the best at mapping. They're going to be way more accessible, and they're going to be way easier to kind of get started as well. They'll still be pretty much good at what they're good at. You might have some easier time league starting them. However, if you're trying to push the Atlas, you're trying to fill it out, you're trying to get full completion and all sorts of stuff like that, you're probably still better served starting with a league starter build and transitioning into a bow build when you have your feet under you and you don't need to kill any big spooky bosses. Because despite the fact that they're getting all this damage and you might be able to focus a little bit more on defense, the characters just aren't built for it. It's like basically like self-cast, and you don't have any of the defenses to back it up. The general rule with bossing is you either need to be able to one-shot the boss as a miner, or you need to be able to tank a lot of its mechanics, or basically you need to be a mechanical god. Most of us don't have the third one there, so you need to be able to tank some hits, so that generally means playing a reasonably beefy character, of which bows are not. But if you're exclusively interested in speed mapping, you're not really too interested in bossing, I could definitely see a world in which you may have a pretty fun time league starting a bow character, assuming there's no big bosses in the way of you getting through the Atlas. It could be a reasonable pick. Hope you guys have enjoyed my bow breakdown here. It seems to be an overall net buff, pending how crazy they go on the base physical damage, but overall Elemental looks like it's in a reasonably good place. The only thing that didn't really get any significant buffs is the dexterity stacking version, but that was already kind of requiring a lot of gear and kind of going the way of the dinosaur compared to the physical kind of counterpart, and I imagine with these buffs the physical counterpart's only going to get stronger. So that's kind of all I got for you guys on bows. Hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Cheers.